The chandeliers glittered like frozen rain, scattering light across a room dressed in elegance and ego. 100 whispers floated through the air, the kind that sliced deeper than knives. In the center of it all stood Emily, alone, fragile, yet strangely dignified in her simple red dress. Every sparkle of diamond around her felt like a sneer. Then came the voice that would echo in her mind for years. "You don't belong here." The words cracked through the silence like a whip. Heads turned. Laughter rippled softly, the kind that hides behind raised champagne glasses. Emily froze, her fingers curling against her arms as if trying to hold herself together. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned the music, every beat a reminder that she shouldn't have come. Yet she stood there, refusing to flee. The woman who spoke, tall, composed and cruel, smiled like someone who had just claimed victory. Around her, a small circle of guests nodded in agreement, their eyes gleaming with judgment. "This is a private event," the woman continued, her tone sweet as poison. "Perhaps you took a wrong turn, dear." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. Her silence became their entertainment. Someone giggled. Another whispered, "Look at her dress. Did she come straight from a thrift shop?" Emily's throat tightened. Her dress had been chosen carefully, a reflection of humility, not wealth. But here, simplicity was sin. She felt every mocking gaze pierce her skin, every chuckle echo like thunder inside her chest. Still, she did not look down. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, just enough to show she hadn't broken yet. For a brief second, her eyes met the woman's, and the smug smile faltered. There was something in Emily's gaze, something calm, unwavering, and painfully human. The crowd didn't notice it, but the woman did. Power, even in silence, has its own language. Then from somewhere near the bar, a man's voice whispered, "Who invited her anyway?" The question rippled through the crowd like wildfire. "Maybe she's staff," another suggested. "She doesn't belong among us." The cruelty disguised as amusement filled the air with venom. Emily could almost taste it, bitter, metallic, suffocating. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the fabric at her waist, pretending composure. The lights above her seemed too bright, revealing too much. Every muscle in her body screamed to leave, yet her soul whispered, "Stay." Deep inside, she knew there was a reason she was meant to be here tonight, even if they didn't. The orchestra resumed softly, pretending nothing had happened, but the tension lingered like smoke. The woman turned away, her laughter echoing as though the scene had been a performance for her amusement. Emily took a deep breath, her pulse still racing. She had never felt so small, yet never more certain that this moment mattered. For a fleeting instant, Emily's gaze drifted to the far end of the hall, a grand portrait of an older man, painted with the same steady eyes as her husband's. A strange comfort washed over her. If Daniel were here, she thought, he'd tell me to hold my ground. So she did, quietly, gracefully, against the weight of every stare. But that's not where her story ends. It's where it begins. Before we go back to how Emily found herself in this cruel scene, would you have defended her or stayed silent? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment what you would have done. Because this night is about to reveal truths no one in that ballroom saw coming. The morning sun spilled softly across the kitchen table, catching dust motes in the air like golden snow. Emily sat with a cup of tea, tracing the rim absent-mindedly as the radio hummed a gentle tune. Her home was small but warm, filled with books, framed photographs, and the scent of vanilla candles. It wasn't the kind of place where people wore diamonds. It was where kindness lived. That was enough for her. Daniel entered quietly, his tie slightly crooked, his smile the kind that made the world gentler. "You didn't sleep much," he said, pouring coffee into his cup. "I could tell." Emily smiled faintly. "I was thinking about tonight," she admitted. He looked up, eyes full of something unreadable, love mixed with a secret she didn't know existed. "You'll be perfect," he assured. She wanted to believe him, but her stomach twisted when she looked at the gold-trimmed invitation lying on the counter. "A charity gala," she read aloud, her tone uncertain, "hosted by Victoria Langford." The name felt heavy on her tongue, familiar somehow. Daniel's expression didn't change, but a shadow passed through his eyes. "She's old family," he said simply. "It's for a good cause." Emily studied him, trying to read between the lines. She had known Daniel as a man of simplicity, driven, grounded, never boastful. The idea of him connected to someone like Victoria seemed out of place. "You're sure you want me to go?" she asked softly. He reached across the table and took her hand. "More than anything, it's time they met you." There was pride in his voice, but also caution. After he left for work, Emily walked through the quiet rooms, lost in thought. She paused at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys without pressing them. Music used to calm her nerves. Now it only echoed her anxiety. She looked again at the invitation resting near a small vase of daisies. "You don't belong here," she whispered, testing the words that had haunted her in dreams she couldn't explain. They sounded too familiar. By afternoon, she stood before her closet, uncertain what to wear. Lace, silk, satin, none of it felt like her. In the end, she chose the red dress, simple, honest. The same one Daniel had once said made her look like the heart of the room. She smiled at the memory, unaware of how that dress would soon define an entire night. She smoothed the fabric gently, like preparing armor. Her reflection in the mirror stared back, calm, composed, and slightly afraid. The woman in the glass looked ready, but Emily wasn't sure if she truly was. "It's just dinner," she told herself. But deep down, something about the evening felt larger than that. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting for her to step into a story she didn't choose. As evening approached, she waited by the window, watching the last blush of daylight fade into twilight. Daniel had promised to join her later, but his business dinner was running long. "Go ahead," he'd said on the phone, his voice steady but distant. "I'll meet you there." Emily hesitated, but she didn't want to disappoint him. She gathered her things and stepped into the night. The city lights shimmered as the car drove her toward the mansion. Her heart thudded in rhythm with the tires against the road. She thought of Daniel, of how proud he'd looked that morning, and told herself this was just another evening, a chance to help others, to belong. But the closer she got, the more uneasy she felt. The road to luxury, she realized, is often paved with quiet warnings. When the car stopped before the grand estate, Emily caught her breath. The mansion glowed like a palace, every window alive with laughter and light. She stepped out, her red dress catching the wind, her heels clicking softly against marble. The doorman smiled politely, as if uncertain who she was. And for a moment, as she stood before those golden doors, Emily wondered, would they even let her in? The invitation still lay on the table when Emily returned from her morning errands, its gold edges catching the light like a promise and a warning. She picked it up. Again, tracing the embossed letters with her fingertip, Victoria Langford. The name gleamed in elegant cursive, dripping with entitlement. Even the paper smelled expensive, lavender and arrogance. "A night of generosity," it read. Emily felt the irony before she even arrived. Daniel had mentioned Victoria only once before, in passing. "She's an old acquaintance from my parents' circle," he'd said, his tone clipped, almost protective. Emily hadn't asked more. She trusted him. But as she stared at the lavish card, something inside her stirred, curiosity mixed with quiet dread. What kind of world did her husband once belong to? And why had he left it behind? That afternoon, she called her friend Maria, the only person she confided in. "It's just a dinner," Maria said gently. "Be yourself. That's more than enough." Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes being yourself isn't what people want," she replied softly. She looked down at her hands, hands used to work, to care, not to impress. They didn't shine like diamonds, but they held honesty, and that, she hoped, would be enough. She opened her wardrobe again, searching for something elegant yet simple. The red dress hung there, timeless and understated. When she'd bought it years ago, she hadn't realized it would someday face a room full of people eager to judge her worth. She ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling both comforted and exposed. "You'll do," she whispered. The dress said nothing, but somehow it understood. Later that evening, Daniel returned home, his expression tired but affectionate. "You're sure you want to go alone?" he asked, helping her fasten her bracelet. "They can be particular." Emily smiled faintly. "I can handle particular." He chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That's my girl." But as he stepped back, his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, like a man torn between pride and worry. On the drive to the mansion, Emily's thoughts swirled like smoke. The city lights flickered across the car windows, each reflection a glimpse of the life she never asked for. She thought of the people she'd meet, their designer gowns, their champagne smiles, and wondered if kindness existed among them. But beneath her nerves, a spark of determination burned quietly. If she had to stand among them, she would do so with grace. When the car turned onto Langford Lane, the world changed. The mansion appeared like something from another era. Columns, fountains, music drifting through open doors. Guests arrived in sleek cars, laughter echoing in the night. The air smelled of roses and ambition. As Emily stepped out, her heels clicked against marble, announcing her presence to a world that had already decided she didn't belong. A valet reached for her keys, his polite smile practiced, almost pitying. "Good evening, ma'am." His tone was kind, but his eyes flickered with recognition, the look of someone who knew she wasn't from this world. Emily nodded politely, pretending not to notice. Behind her, another guest stepped out of a limousine in a gown made of sequins that caught every flash of light. Emily's red dress suddenly felt too plain, too human. At the grand doors, she hesitated. She could still turn around, go home, forget the invitation ever existed. But Daniel's words replayed in her mind. "It's time they met you." She took a deep breath and handed her name to the attendant. "Emily," she said, her voice steady. "Emily Bennett." The man scanned the list, then smiled stiffly and nodded her through. She stepped into the unknown. Inside, the world seemed to shimmer. The chandelier above sparkled like 1,000 eyes, and every polished surface reflected luxury. Conversations drifted in elegant tones, laughter layered with hidden meaning. Emily stood for a moment, lost among strangers who all seemed to know each other, and to know that she didn't belong. And somewhere in that crowd, a pair of eyes, sharp, watchful, and cruel, had already found her. The grand foyer opened before her like a cathedral of wealth, white marble floors, gold trim, chandeliers that looked like captured constellations. The air shimmered with perfume and expectation. A string quartet played somewhere beyond the staircase, the music delicate and distant. Emily's footsteps echoed softly, drawing subtle glances from the clusters of guests nearby. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes were sharp. She adjusted her clutch nervously, offering a small smile to a waiter who passed by with champagne. He nodded respectfully, but she caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes. He, too, sensed she didn't belong here. The laughter of nearby women rang like crystal breaking, sharp and sweet all at once. Emily's pulse quickened. She had never felt the weight of her simplicity so heavily. To her left, a grand mirror reflected the room in perfect symmetry, crystal, velvet, silk, and gold. And there, in the reflection, she saw herself, the only splash of red in a sea of black and silver. For a moment it felt almost poetic, like courage disguised as color. But then she noticed the whispers forming behind her, and poetry turned into discomfort. The mirror didn't lie. She truly stood out. A man in a tuxedo approached her with a courteous nod. "Welcome, madam. May I take your coat?" His tone was gentle, but Emily sensed something rehearsed about it, as if he wasn't sure whether to treat her as a guest or an intruder. "Thank you," she said softly, handing it over. He hesitated a second too long before walking away. The silence that followed clung to her like static. Further ahead, laughter erupted near the bar. Emily turned just in time to see a small group glance her way, their smiles turning into murmurs. She couldn't hear the words, but she could feel their tone. Mocking, dismissive, entertained. Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin, pretending not to notice. "You belong here," she told herself, "if only because you decided to be." She wandered toward the ballroom, drawn by the glow spilling through tall doors. The sight stole her breath. Hundreds of people, tables adorned with roses, silver trays gleaming under soft light. It was beautiful, but cold. Every smile she met felt measured, every conversation layered with status and performance. It wasn't a celebration. It was a competition dressed as elegance. Emily found herself standing near a large portrait, an oil painting of an older gentleman, poised and proud. His eyes, strikingly similar to Daniel's, seemed to follow her. For a moment, warmth flickered in her chest, a reminder of the man who grounded her world. "You'd tell me to breathe," she whispered under her breath. The portrait said nothing, but somehow it felt like agreement. Just then, a tall woman in an ivory gown appeared at the edge of the crowd. Her posture was impeccable, her smile polished, her confidence unshakable. Emily recognized her instantly from the invitation, Victoria Langford. Their eyes met briefly, and something icy passed between them. Victoria's smile widened, but her gaze carried the quiet amusement of someone already judging. Victoria approached with calculated grace, a glass of champagne in hand. "You must be new," she said, her tone honeyed and curious. "I don't believe we've met." Emily smiled politely. "Emily Bennett." The name seemed to surprise her hostess, though she masked it quickly. "Ah," Victoria murmured, "of course." Her eyes flicked once more over Emily's red dress, then back to her face. "Lovely choice." Emily nodded, unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. As Victoria walked away, a faint trail of perfume lingered, a scent of power disguised as sweetness. Emily exhaled slowly, feeling the chill left in her wake. She turned back to the ballroom and saw the space differently now, not a party, but a stage. And she had just been cast as the evening's next performance. The hum of conversation swirled like perfume around Emily as she moved toward the refreshment table. Laughter rang like wind chimes in the distance, graceful yet cutting. She reached for a glass of sparkling water, hoping to disappear into the background, but invisibility was a luxury she wasn't allowed. Every few steps, she felt eyes tracking her, curious, condescending, assessing. It was as though she'd stepped into a room built to remind her she didn't belong. She paused near the grand piano, where the soft melody of a nocturne floated through the air. For a fleeting moment, the music comforted her. Then she heard it, the first whisper. Who invited her? The voice was delicate, almost playful, but the cruelty beneath it was sharp enough to draw blood. Another voice followed, lower and mocking. She must have wandered in from the service staff. The sound of their laughter shattered the fragile spell of the music. Emily froze, her hand tightening around her glass. Her reflection trembled in the liquid surface, eyes glistening under the chandelier's glow. She wanted to turn, to look them in the face, but pride kept her still. Instead, she took a deep breath and pretended she hadn't heard. Pretending was safer. It preserved dignity when words could not. Nearby, two women in black gowns leaned close to each other, whispering behind manicured fingers. "That dress," one said. "Red? At a Langford event?" The other smirked. "How bold." Their tone wasn't admiration, it was amusement wrapped in scorn. Emily lifted her chin slightly, staring at the rows of crystal glasses each one flawless and fragile, like her composure. Her mind began to race, seeking refuge in Daniel's voice. "You'll be perfect." But perfect wasn't what this room wanted. They wanted spectacle. They wanted to see her crumble. She could almost feel the tension curling around her shoulders, invisible hands tightening their grip. Still, she refused to give them that satisfaction. She stood taller, her silence a quiet rebellion. The pianist's melody shifted to something lighter, but the laughter behind her remained heavy. Emily's heart beat in rhythm with the keys, measured, careful, hiding pain beneath beauty. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a nearby silver platter, calm on the outside, trembling within. The sight almost broke her. But then she remembered Daniel's pride that morning, and somehow she steadied. She walked toward a large window overlooking the garden, desperate for air. The night outside was peaceful, almost mocking in its serenity. Through the glass, she could see roses swaying under moonlight, untouched by judgment, beautiful simply because they existed. "I shouldn't care," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Caring was what made her human, and tonight humanity felt like a weakness. When she turned back, the whispers hadn't stopped. They had multiplied. "She's not one of us," a man muttered. "I heard she married into money." "That explains." "The dress," another added. Emily's pulse thudded in her ears, drowning the chatter. She realized that even surrounded by hundreds of people, she had never felt more alone. The ballroom seemed to grow colder with every word. A waiter passed by and offered her a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Thank you," she said softly. His small smile, genuine and kind, felt like a lifeline. For a heartbeat, she remembered that decency still existed in the world. She returned the smile, fragile but real. And though her hands trembled, she found the strength to stay. Leaving now would mean they'd won, and Emily Bennett didn't bow to cruelty. As the music swelled again, the night shimmered with false charm. Conversations continued, laughter resumed, and the world pretended nothing had happened. But Emily knew something inside her had changed. She had felt the sting of judgment, and it had awakened something quiet, powerful, and waiting. A storm was forming behind her calm eyes, and soon it would be impossible to ignore. The crowd parted slightly as Victoria Langford glided toward Emily, her gown trailing like smoke across the marble floor. The host's every movement carried purpose, every smile rehearsed to perfection. Emily turned, startled but polite as the woman approached. "You must be the new volunteer," Victoria said sweetly, her voice like honey hiding shards of glass. "But, my dear, dinner doesn't begin the staff until later." Emily blinked, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "I'm not staff," she replied softly, her tone careful. "I'm attending." Victoria tilted her head, eyes narrowing with feigned confusion. "Oh," she murmured, pretending to understand. "How lovely. And who invited you, darling?" The surrounding guests grew quiet, leaning subtly closer. The question hung in the air like perfume, beautiful, but suffocating. "My husband, Daniel Bennett," Emily answered, her voice steadier than she felt. For a brief second, Victoria's expression flickered. Surprise, then calculation. "Daniel," she repeated slowly. "How interesting." A low hum spread through the crowd, the name passing between them like gossip set aflame. Emily could feel their eyes, curious, doubtful, dissecting. She wanted to shrink, but pride anchored her feet. Victoria's smile returned, sharper this time. "I see," she said. "Well, you to come alone." It's brave of her tone carried the subtle cruelty of a dagger wrapped in silk. "Daniel was always such a private man. I didn't realize he'd remarried." The words sliced deeper than intended, a public unveiling disguised as conversation. Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her gaze steady. "Yes," she said quietly. "We've been married for 3 years." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with judgment. Then came the soft, collective exhale of gossip being born. Someone at the nearby table whispered, 3 years? I thought he'd sworn off society after..." But the sentence never finished. Victoria lifted her glass delicately, smiling as if to say enough. The crowd obeyed her silent command. She was queen here, and the ballroom was her throne. "Well," Victoria said finally, setting down her drink, "you must find these gatherings quite different from your usual evenings." The sentence seemed innocent, but the venom hid in every syllable. Emily smiled faintly, the kind of smile people use when they're bleeding but refuse to show it. "Different," she agreed, her tone polite, her pride intact. Victoria's lips curved, almost approvingly. "How refreshing." A passing photographer paused, lifting his camera toward the 2 women. "May I?" he asked. Victoria nodded graciously, turning toward the lens, but Emily hesitated. The flash came anyway, light bursting across her face, blinding and merciless. When her vision cleared, Victoria was already thanking the photographer. "Do make sure she gets a copy," she said smoothly. "For the memory." Emily wanted to laugh, though it wouldn't have sounded kind. She realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was initiation. The whispers, the smiles, the false courtesy. This was how they tested newcomers. And she had just failed her first test simply by existing. Still, she straightened her shoulders and said, "It's a lovely event, Miss Langford." Her voice didn't shake. That was victory enough. Victoria's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "I'm delighted you think so," she replied. "Enjoy the evening." Then she turned and walked away, her perfume lingering like the ghost of power. The moment she disappeared into the crowd, the whispers began again, more brazen now. Emily stood alone in the glittering chaos, her heart pounding. She felt the sting of humiliation, but beneath it something colder began to grow. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was awareness. She understood now that this world thrived on hierarchy and cruelty disguised as elegance. And she knew deep down that if Daniel were here, he'd see what they truly were. But he wasn't. And so, surrounded by chandeliers and false smiles, Emily did the only thing she could. She smiled back. The performance had begun, and she refused to let them see her break. The dining hall shimmered with candlelight, each flame reflected 100 times in the crystal glasses that lined the long mahogany table. Emily followed the host's subtle gesture toward her seat, far from the center, near the edge where the waiters passed quietly in and out. The distance wasn't an accident. Every guest's position said something about their worth, and hers said everything. Still, she smiled politely, sitting with practiced grace. A string of laughter rose from the upper end of the table where Victoria presided like royalty. The conversations there were bright, lively, effortless. Emily's corner, by contrast, was quiet, too quiet. The 2 women beside her exchanged polite nods, but quickly turned to speak to others, leaving Emily adrift in silence. The soft clinking of silverware filled the emptiness, rhythmic and cruel. She tried to focus on the food before her, roasted duck, jeweled with sauce and precision. It was beautiful, but tasted like nothing. Her appetite had been replaced by awareness, by the strange heaviness of being watched without being seen. Across the room, she caught Victoria glancing her way, whispering something to a man at her side. His laughter followed, smooth and amused. Emily lowered her eyes. Halfway through the first course, a waiter tripped near her chair, the wineglass tilted, crimson spilling across the white tablecloth. Gasps rose. Emily reached instinctively to help, but before she could speak, Victoria's voice cut through the air. "Oh dear," she said lightly. "How fitting." The room chuckled softly. Emily froze, her cheeks burning as the waiter apologized repeatedly. "It's all right," she murmured, but the laughter lingered. She dabbed at the edge of the spill with her napkin, feeling the room's attention fade like retreating waves. The waiter's eyes met hers briefly, apologetic, grateful, human. That look grounded her again. "Accidents happen," she whispered to him, her tone kind. He nodded, but she could see his shame. She wanted to tell him not to worry, that she understood what it meant to be humiliated quietly in front of the powerful. Dinner resumed, conversation flowing again like nothing had happened, but the stain remained, a scar of red across white linen right beside Emily's plate. Every time she looked at it, it reminded her of something, how easily reputation could be tainted by a single moment. She folded her napkin carefully, hiding the mark. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it made her feel in control again. As the second course began, she noticed the portraits lining the walls, men and women of old wealth, frozen in oil and time. Their painted eyes followed her with silent judgment, regal and unkind. One portrait in particular caught her attention, an older man with silver hair and the same steady gaze Daniel had. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart flickering with unease. It was like looking into a secret she wasn't supposed to see. "Are you all right, dear?" The woman beside her finally spoke, her tone sugary but distant. Emily smiled gently. "Yes, thank you." The woman nodded once before turning back to her dessert. The brief acknowledgement almost made Emily laugh. It was the kind of politeness that existed only to fill silence, not to offer warmth. Still, she appreciated the gesture. Sometimes even empty kindness was something. Toward the far end of the table, Victoria raised her glass in a light-hearted toast, her eyes never leaving Emily. "To generosity," she declared, "and to knowing one's place in the world." The guests laughed, unaware or perhaps too aware of the target hidden in her words. Emily lifted her glass slowly, her face calm, her eyes unflinching. She sipped the champagne, bitter and cold, and set it down without a word. The music swelled again, drowning out the last of the laughter. Emily's gaze drifted toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass like an outsider looking in. For the first time she felt kinship with the darkness. It too existed beyond their glittering walls. Her pulse slowed, her heart steadying. They could humiliate her, but they could not define her. And in that quiet defiance, the storm within her began to stir once more. The clinking of silverware slowed as Victoria rose from her seat, her glass held high. "A toast," she announced, her voice sweet and commanding. The chatter softened, replaced by curiosity. Emily looked up from her plate, uneasy. Something in Victoria's smile told her this wasn't a gesture of kindness, it was entertainment, and she was the subject. "To all the wonderful guests who make our charity events so radiant," Victoria began, her gaze sweeping the table. "And of course, to those who remind us that generosity takes many forms." The crowd chuckled, not understanding, or pretending not to. "Some come with wealth," she continued. "Others simply with heart." Her eyes locked on Emily as she said it. The laughter this time was real. Emily's hand tightened around her glass, the cool stem pressing into her palm. She felt her pulse quicken, her cheeks warm. "Say something," a voice inside her urged, but pride held her tongue still. She'd give them more to feed on. So she smiled faintly, that quiet, practiced smile that hid everything and revealed nothing. Across the table, Victoria's expression hardened. She had wanted a reaction. "Tell us, my dear," Victoria said suddenly, "what inspired your lovely choice of attire tonight?" Her tone was bright, innocent enough for the audience, but Emily could hear the dagger beneath. Heads turned toward her. Every eye waited for her to stumble. "Red," someone whispered. "How bold! How inappropriate!" another murmured. The whispers collided like soft applause. Emily lifted her gaze and met Victoria's stare. "I wore it because my husband once told me red reminded him of courage," she said softly. Her voice trembled only slightly, enough to sound human, not weak. The room fell silent. For the first time that night, Victoria didn't have an immediate reply. Emily took a small sip of champagne, her composure absolute. The silence cut deeper than any insult could. But Victoria recovered quickly, laughter bubbling up like champagne. "How poetic," she said. "Courage at a dinner table, how very modern." The guests laughed with her, the moment of sympathy vanishing. Emily smiled again, though her heart thudded painfully. It wasn't courage she felt anymore. It was endurance, the kind that grows stronger every time it's tested. "Perhaps," Victoria continued, "we should toast to that too, courage in all its forms." The irony hung thick in the air. Glasses lifted, crystal clinked, and the moment passed like a shadow, but not for Emily. Every word, every glance had carved something inside her, something unbreakable. They thought they were diminishing her. Instead, they were defining her resolve. She caught sight of the same waiter from earlier, standing quietly by the doorway. Their eyes met, and in his brief, respectful nod, she found a fragment of humanity. It was enough to steady her heartbeat. She straightened her back, adjusted her napkin, and rejoined the conversation around her with grace. If they wanted to turn her into a spectacle, she would become one they could never forget. The dinner moved on, the laughter returning. But the mood had changed. The cruelty had been unleashed fully now, smiles sharpened, compliments twisted. Yet amid the noise, Emily sat like a flame, refusing to be extinguished. Every humiliation only made her light burn steadier. Somewhere deep down, she sensed a shift in the night. The balance of power, though invisible, had begun to tilt. Victoria lifted her glass one final time, her voice smooth as silk. "To courage," she repeated. Emily mirrored her gesture, eyes calm, unflinching. "To courage," she echoed. Their gazes locked for a moment longer than polite, and in that silent standoff, something passed between them. Not surrender, but warning. The game had begun in earnest, and Emily Bennett was done playing by their rules. The dessert arrived like a cruel joke, champagne sorbet served in crystal bowls that sparkled under the chandeliers. Emily stared at it blankly, the cold sweetness melting before she could even touch it. Around her, laughter filled the air again, louder now, almost reckless. The alcohol had loosened tongues and sharpened cruelty. Victoria was radiant, basking in her control. Emily sat still, a storm brewing behind calm eyes. The first drop of trouble came swiftly. A waiter, stumbling slightly, bumped the back of her chair. The glass in his hand tilted, sending champagne splashing across her red dress. Gasps erupted around the table. Emily shot to her feet, the liquid dripping down her arms, glittering like liquid gold beneath the light. "Oh my," Victoria exclaimed, her voice drenched in feigned concern. "How terribly fitting." The laughter that followed was soft, but deadly. A woman down the table covered. Her mouth pretending to be shocked, but her eyes gleamed. The men smirked. The moment stretched endlessly. Emily's chest tightened, her face flushed hot with humiliation. For a second she couldn't breathe. She heard the murmur ripple through the crowd, half pity, half amusement. "She's soaked," someone whispered. "How embarrassing." Victoria rose slowly, reaching for a napkin she had no intention of using. "Accidents happen," she said, her tone sugar-coated and cruel. "Though I must say, red does hide stains beautifully." Her words landed like slaps. Emily's fingers clenched around the edge of the table, nails pressing into the linen. Her reflection shimmered in the spilled champagne, distorted, trembling, but still standing. She could feel tears building, pressing behind her eyes like a tide, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not for them. Instead, she inhaled slowly, the breath steadying her heartbeat. Then she looked directly at Victoria and said quietly, "You're right, red hides everything." The words were soft, but the meaning wasn't lost. For the first time all evening, Victoria blinked. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had ever been. A few guests looked down at their plates, ashamed or pretending to be. The waiter stood frozen, mortified, his tray trembling. Emily turned to him with a small, forgiving smile. "It's all right," she said gently. Truly. Her kindness disarmed him, the contrast between her grace and their cruelty now impossible to ignore. "I should go," Emily murmured finally, her voice calm but final. The words landed like a whisper of thunder. She dabbed at her dress with a napkin, careful, dignified. Around her no one moved to stop her. Some looked relieved, others uncomfortable. Only Victoria watched her with a faint smirk, victory glittering in her eyes. But even that smile began to falter as Emily lifted her chin and met her gaze. Without another word, Emily stepped back from the table. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each sound echoing like a heartbeat in the silence she left behind. The room seemed to contract around her absence, the brightness of the chandeliers dimmed by the weight of what had just happened. She passed the waiter again, offering him one last kind nod. He bowed slightly, guilt etched into his face. The hallway beyond the ballroom felt colder, quieter, an escape and a wound at once. Emily walked slowly, her dress heavy with champagne, her pride the only thing keeping her upright. Every step carried the echo of laughter she would never forget. At the door, she paused, looking back at the glittering crowd behind her. They hadn't won. They had only revealed themselves. As the doors closed behind her, the noise of the ballroom faded into distant murmurs. Outside, the night was still and dark, the sky spread wide like a blank page. Emily took a deep breath, tasting the freedom in the air. For the first time that night, she felt real again. Small, soaked, but whole. Somewhere in the distance, an engine approached. Daniel was coming, and the night wasn't finished with them yet. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence outside the mansion. Emily turned toward the driveway, just as a sleek black car came to a stop beneath the golden lights. The driver hurried around to open the door, and out stepped Daniel, tall, composed, unaware of the chaos he was walking into. His presence, calm and commanding, seemed to change the air itself. For the first time that evening, Emily felt her heart steady. He spotted her immediately, standing alone near the fountain, her red dress darkened by stains that shimmered under the moonlight. "Emily?" His voice was low, careful, almost disbelieving. She tried to smile but couldn't. The words tangled in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered instead. "I shouldn't have come alone." Daniel frowned, stepping closer, his eyes scanning her face. "What happened?" Emily shook her head, not trusting her voice. Daniel reached out and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek, his touch both gentle and furious in restraint. "Who did this?" he asked quietly. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like thunder before a storm. Emily looked away, her gaze falling on the glowing windows of the ballroom. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. "Let's just go." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It matters," he said. "It matters a great deal." The softness in his voice was gone now, replaced by something cold and precise. Emily knew that tone. She'd heard it only a handful of times, usually when Daniel dealt with people who underestimated him. He took her hand and pressed it gently. "Wait here," he said. "Please." The last word wasn't a command. It was a promise. She wanted to stop him, to tell him not to go back in, but something in his eyes, a quiet certainty, held her still. Daniel turned and walked toward the mansion, his silhouette framed by light. The guards at the entrance straightened instinctively, recognizing authority they hadn't known he possessed. Emily watched him go, her heart torn between fear and awe. The night had shifted. The balance of power was about to follow. Inside, the music still played, soft and elegant, as if nothing had happened. Victoria was laughing at something when the doors opened again, her laughter dying the moment she saw him. Daniel Bennett entered the room like a secret the world had forgotten to tell. Every head turned. He moved with quiet control, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on her. "Where is my wife?" he asked. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Victoria blinked, caught off guard. "Your wife?" she repeated, her smile faltering. "Oh, you mean—" She didn't finish. Daniel's gaze froze her mid-sentence. "Emily Bennett," he said, each word deliberate. "She was here. You saw her." The air grew heavy, the kind of silence that feels like the moment before lightning strikes. Victoria swallowed hard. "Yes, of course. She stepped outside." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice, though every person in the room could hear. "Then I suggest you show her the respect you failed to offer before." His calmness was more terrifying than rage. Around them, whispers stirred, questions, realizations, guilt. Victoria's painted smile trembled. "Daniel, you misunderstand," she began. But he cut her off with a quiet, measured tone. "No, I understand perfectly." Outside, through the open doors, Emily could hear the murmurs building inside, the sound of pretenses cracking. She stood by the fountain, watching her reflection ripple in the water. For the first time, she wasn't trembling. Something in her knew Daniel wasn't just defending her pride, he was reclaiming something much bigger. The truth was on its way out, and no amount of wealth or cruelty could stop it. The doors opened again. Daniel stepped out, the tension still clinging to him like static. He walked straight to Emily and took her hand. "Come with me," he said softly. His anger had cooled into resolve, the kind that never needed to shout to be heard. She hesitated only a second before nodding. As they turned back toward the ballroom, the music stopped completely. Everyone inside was waiting, and none of them were ready. The two of them crossed the threshold together, hand in hand. Every whisper, every cruel word that had been spoken that night, now hung in the air like ghosts. Daniel's gaze swept the crowd, landing finally on Victoria, whose composure had begun to crumble. Emily stood beside him, her chin lifted, her face serene despite the stains on her dress. The performance was over. The reckoning had begun. The ballroom fell into an almost holy silence as Daniel and Emily entered. The light seemed softer now, dimmed by guilt and anticipation. Victoria stood frozen near the head of the table, her perfect smile cracking at the edges. Every whisper died as Daniel guided Emily forward, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the hall. He stopped near the center, releasing her hand only to face the crowd. "I believe," he began, his voice calm but heavy, "my wife was treated unfairly this evening." The word unfairly trembled with restraint, as if holding back the fire beneath. No one spoke. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely. 100 eyes flickered between the stained red of Emily's dress and the steady calm of Daniel's gaze. "I came here tonight to support this charity," he continued, "but it seems some came to display something far less noble." Victoria tried to laugh, the sound brittle and false. "Daniel, darling," she said lightly, "there's been a misunderstanding. Emily, your wife, of course. She must have felt out of place. You know how these events can be for newcomers." The condescension lingered like smoke. Daniel turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "A misunderstanding," he repeated softly. "Yes, I'd say that's accurate, but not mine." He stepped forward, and with each word the room seemed to shrink around him. "When I purchased this property 5 years ago," he said, "I wanted it to remain a place of art, of history, of kindness. My family believed in that. Imagine my disappointment when I learned the people I'd trusted to run it had turned it into a stage for cruelty." The weight of his revelation fell like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria's color drained. Your property," she stammered. Daniel nodded once, cold and clear. "Yes. This mansion, this hall, this event, everything you see here belongs to me. The staff, the grounds, the very roof under which you chose to humiliate my wife." His voice didn't rise, but its precision struck harder than any shout. "You did it in her home." For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. The truth hung in the air, shimmering like the chandeliers above them. Emily stood silently beside him, her eyes glistening, not with triumph but with the ache of long-withheld justice. She hadn't needed to say a word. The truth itself was speaking for her now, and it spoke louder than laughter ever could. "I have been patient," Daniel continued, "because power is not proven by shouting, it's shown by restraint." He turned his gaze toward the faces around him, people who'd laughed, whispered, or stayed silent. "You all saw what happened tonight. Remember it, because wealth without decency is nothing. And cruelty, dressed in silk, is still cruelty." The words sliced through the silence, leaving shame in their wake. Victoria took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Daniel, please, if I'd known, you'd have acted differently," he interrupted smoothly. "Which means you always knew what was wrong. You just didn't care until it cost you something." Her breath hitched, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. The mask had fallen. There was nothing left to hide behind but regret. Daniel turned back to Emily, his tone softening. "You don't have to stay here another moment." She looked at him, calm and radiant beneath the dimmed light. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "They needed to see." He smiled faintly, proud, sorrowful, in love. Around them the crowd stood like a gallery of guilt, frozen and silent. For the first time that night, Emily didn't feel small. He placed his hand over hers, their fingers locking together as if sealing the moment forever. "Let's go home," he murmured. But as they turned toward the door, the guests, ashamed and awed, parted to make way. No one dared speak. And though the music never resumed, something far more powerful filled the air. The sound of dignity reclaimed, echoing long after their footsteps faded. The ballroom, once alive with chatter and music, was now a cathedral of silence. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer, as if ashamed to shine too brightly after what had been revealed. No one moved. No one dared. The weight of Daniel's words hung over them like a storm, refusing to pass. Emily stood still, her red dress heavy, her dignity luminous against the hush. For the first time that night, the same people who had whispered about her could not meet her eyes. Heads bowed slightly, glasses rested untouched. A few guests shifted awkwardly, the sound of fabric brushing against chairs filling the void left by laughter. The air smelled faintly of guilt and champagne. two things that never mixed well. Emily didn't speak. She didn't need to. Victoria stood at the far end of the room, her composure unraveling by the second. The elegant lines of her gown seemed to constrict her breathing, the sparkle of her jewelry mocking her shame. "Daniel," she tried, her voice barely audible, "I never meant—" He lifted a hand, quieting her. "Meaning requires empathy," he said calmly, "and empathy requires humanity." Her lips parted, but no words came. Across the table, a few guests began to murmur apologies, small, stumbling words that filled the silence like drops of rain on marble. "We didn't know," one woman whispered. "We thought—" Emily turned toward her, her expression soft but unyielding. "You didn't think," she replied gently. "That's what hurt the most." The woman nodded, her mascara smudged by tears she hadn't expected to shed tonight. Daniel moved closer to Emily, his presence protective but not possessive. He looked around the room, his tone steady and final. "This house was meant to celebrate compassion," he said, "not hierarchy. Tonight will not be remembered for its charity, but for the lack of it." The words struck every heart differently, some with guilt, others with awakening. The silence deepened, but this time it carried meaning. The pianist, unsure what else to do, rested his hands on the keys without playing. Even his hesitation became part of the moment. The mansion seemed to breathe. Again, quietly, as if relieved that the truth had been spoken aloud, Emily glanced around, her eyes meeting those who'd laughed at her earlier. Most looked away. A few, to her surprise, did not. In their gaze, she saw remorse, real and trembling. Victoria took a step forward, her voice cracking. "Emily, please, I'm sorry." It was barely more than a whisper. The crowd held its breath. Emily watched her carefully, the proud woman now stripped of her armor, her beauty humanized by regret. "I hope you are," Emily said, her tone calm, almost kind, "because apologies only matter when they change something." Victoria lowered her head. The lesson had been learned, painfully. Daniel reached for Emily's hand again. The touch was grounding, the quiet intimacy of two people who had survived something neither of them chose. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked softly. She looked at him, her eyes clear, her posture regal. "Yes," she said. "I've said everything I needed to, without saying anything at all." The faintest smile curved her lips. The silence between them was peace. They turned toward the grand doors, the sound of their footsteps once again filling the vast space. But this time, the echo didn't carry humiliation. It carried grace. The guests parted instinctively, heads lowered, some whispering blessings, others too ashamed to speak. As Emily passed, a few reached out, as if hoping her forgiveness might brush against them. She didn't look back. When the doors closed behind them, the ballroom exhaled as though waking from a long nightmare. Inside, the chandeliers flickered once, catching the light like distant stars. The whispers that followed were softer now, no longer cruel but reflective. In the stillness she left behind, Emily Bennett had changed something no speech could. Her silence had become the loudest sound of the night. Outside the ballroom, the night was soft and endless. The garden lights shimmered across the marble steps as Emily paused, letting the cool air wash over her. Behind her, the echoes of silence still lingered in the hall, a silence she had earned. Daniel stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her back. "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "I didn't handle it," she said. "I just refused to let them handle me." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by roses and moonlight. The sounds of the city were distant, muted by the vastness of the estate. Emily lifted her head toward the stars, her reflection glimmering faintly in the fountain's water. "You always said people show who they are when they think no one's watching," she murmured. "Tonight, They showed me everything. Daniel looked at her, pride softening his expression. And so did you. But Emily wasn't thinking of pride. She was thinking of meaning. She turned back toward the mansion, where guests were beginning to leave in hushed clusters. Something in her heart wouldn't let her walk away completely. They came for charity, she said quietly, and they'll leave with something better, perspective. Daniel followed her gaze, understanding immediately. You want to go back in? She nodded, just for a moment. When they re-entered, the atmosphere had changed entirely. Gone were the bright, mocking smiles and the false laughter. People stood in quiet groups, humbled, whispering apologies to no one in particular. The music had not resumed. It didn't need to. As Emily stepped into the room, all eyes turned to her again, but this time not out of ridicule. The air shifted. Reverence replaced cruelty. Victoria was the first to move. Her steps were hesitant, her chin lowered. Mrs. Bennet, she said softly, the title tasting strange on her tongue. I can't undo what was said. But I am truly sorry. The room waited, breath held for Emily's response. She looked at Victoria, saw not power, not arrogance, but a woman who'd finally seen herself clearly. Then do better, Emily replied gently. That's all any of us can do. A murmur of agreement spread through the room, fragile but sincere. Emily smiled, small, graceful, real. I hope the charity still benefits from tonight, she added, her voice carrying easily through the space. It's why we were all supposed to be here, wasn't it? The simplicity of her words landed like truth, disguised as kindness. Daniel watched her with quiet awe. Even in pain, she led with empathy. As guests approached her, one by one, the apologies became less formal and more human. A woman who'd whispered about her dress earlier said tearfully, "You looked beautiful. I was jealous, not cruel." Emily nodded, accepting without bitterness. We all fight battles no one else sees, she said softly. Sometimes we lose our kindness in the process. The woman smiled weakly, as if a burden had been lifted. Across the room, the pianist finally began to play again, soft, hesitant notes that seemed to follow Emily's every step. The melody was no longer a performance. It was a tribute. Emily walked past the table where the wine had spilled earlier. The stain was still there, faintly visible under the dim light. She traced it lightly with her fingertips, not in shame, but in remembrance. It's part of the story now, she whispered. When she turned back, Daniel was waiting, his expression full of pride. You didn't have to forgive them, he said quietly. Emily smiled. Forgiveness isn't for them, she answered. It's for me. I won't carry their ugliness home. Her words lingered in the air like perfume, delicate and enduring. Around her the guests bowed their heads, not out of guilt this time, but out of respect. As the music swelled gently, Emily reached for Daniel's hand. Together, they began to walk toward the exit once more. But this time, she didn't look away from the room she was leaving behind. Instead, she offered a final nod, a silent blessing, not of approval, but of closure. The night had begun with humiliation. It ended with grace. And in that grace, Emily Bennet reclaimed not just her dignity, but her peace. The night air outside was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of roses and rain. Emily and Daniel walked down the marble steps hand in hand, their footsteps the only sound. Behind them, the mansion stood quiet, its lights no longer golden, but soft and forgiving. For the first time since arriving, Emily felt the weight lift from her chest. She had come as a stranger and was leaving as something far stronger. Daniel glanced at her, studying her profile illuminated by the moonlight. You're quiet, he said softly. She smiled. Silence feels better than noise. He nodded, understanding. There were no words big enough to hold the night they had just lived. The air between them carried everything unsaid. Shame turned to pride, pain turned to power. Emily's red dress still clung to her, but now it looked like armor. They paused near the fountain, where ripples danced across the surface. The reflection of the mansion shimmered and broke with every breeze. "You know," Emily said after a while, "it's strange. I thought I'd remember the cruelty the most. But I think I'll remember the music, the silence, the people who looked away." Daniel tilted his head, smiling faintly. "You always remember the truth beneath the noise." A soft wind moved through the garden, stirring the petals of fallen roses at their feet. Emily knelt briefly, picking one up, a single red petal the same color as her dress. She turned it over in her fingers, thinking, "People mistake luxury for worth," she said, "but worth isn't something you can buy. It's something you show when no one's watching." Daniel reached down, brushing her cheek. "And you showed them all." The car waited at the end of the driveway, headlights glowing faintly. Emily hesitated before stepping in, glancing back one last time at the towering mansion. It looked smaller now, almost human. Inside, she imagined the guests speaking quietly, reflecting, maybe even changing. "Do you think they'll remember?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "They will. Shame fades, but the truth stays. You gave them both." As they drove away, the city lights flickered in the distance, little stars caught in glass and steel. Emily leaned her head against the window, watching the reflections blur into color. "I used to think belonging meant being accepted," she said softly. "But maybe it just means standing where you choose and staying kind, even when the world isn't." Daniel squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles. "That's why you're different." The road curved, leading them past quiet streets lined with sleeping trees. Emily watched their shadows stretch and vanish under passing lamps. The night felt endless but gentle, like it had forgiven her for everything she'd endured. "I don't hate them," she admitted. "Not even Victoria." Daniel looked at her, surprised. "You should." She shook her head. "If I did, they'd still have power over me." For a moment neither spoke. The hum of the car filled the silence between them. Then Daniel said quietly, "You taught them more tonight than I ever could." Emily smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "I didn't teach them," she said. "I just reminded them." He nodded slowly. "Reminded them of what?" She turned to him, her voice almost a whisper. "That kindness never looks out of place." The house came into view, a modest, warm place glowing softly through its windows. Emily exhaled, relief spreading through her. The contrast between and this home was like two worlds colliding, the false and the real. Daniel parked the car and looked at her. "Home," he said simply. She nodded, smiling faintly. "Where I've always belonged." As they walked to the door, Emily paused beneath the porch light, her hand resting on the doorknob. "You know," she said, "if I ever go back there, I'll wear red again." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You're impossible." "No," she replied, opening the door. "Just unafraid." And with that, Emily stepped inside, carrying not the pain of the night, but the lesson it had taught her, that true grace is quiet, and it never needs permission to shine. Morning crept gently through the curtains, painting soft lines of gold across the living room. Emily sat by the window, still wearing her red dress, its hem now dry but faintly stained with champagne. The world outside was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes after storms. In her lap rested a single rose petal she'd brought from the garden. She turned it slowly, as if holding the night in her hands. Daniel entered quietly, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Too much to remember, too much to feel." He smiled, setting the cup beside her. Then let's remember the right things. She looked up, her eyes bright with exhaustion and clarity. Like what? He paused, thinking. Like the moment you stopped needing their approval. Emily smiled faintly, gazing through the glass at the sunrise. I used to think I wanted to belong, she said. Now I just want to be kind, even when it costs me. Daniel sat beside her, watching the light spill across her face. That's what makes you rare, he murmured. The world doesn't need more rich people, it needs more good ones. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes. Then, I'm wealthy enough. The clock ticked softly in the corner, marking the new day. On the table nearby lay the golden invitation, slightly crumpled, a relic of the night before. Emily picked it up and studied it one last time. They wrote my name on this as if it didn't belong, she whispered. Funny how paper forgets what truth remembers. She tore it gently, letting the pieces fall into the wastebasket. The sound was quiet, final. Outside, sunlight glistened across the dew on the grass, every drop shining like a small victory. Emily stood, stretching, her body light again. You know, she said, turning toward Daniel, that mansion wasn't what it seemed. All that wealth, all that noise. It felt hollow, like a song without melody. Daniel smiled softly. And what does home feel like? She thought for a moment. Like music that finally makes sense. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You were extraordinary last night, he said. I don't think I've ever loved you more. She laughed lightly. You say that after I almost burned every bridge we have? He chuckled. The ones that collapsed were never bridges, they were walls. The words made her heart ache in the best way. She squeezed his hand, grateful for his quiet strength. As the morning grew brighter, Emily wandered to the mirror by the door. Her reflection stared back, not the woman who'd been humiliated, but the one who'd endured it with grace. The faint stain on her dress caught the light, like a scar turned to gold. Worth isn't what survives untouched, she whispered to herself. It's what survives changed. She smiled softly, knowing she'd never see herself the same way again. Daniel joined her, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. Would you do it all again? He asked. Emily considered it. Yes, she said finally, because sometimes the world needs to see what dignity looks like. He kissed her temple. Then they saw it. Outside, a bird sang, the first sound of a forgiving morning. The melody drifted through the room, soft and whole. Emily turned from the mirror and opened the front door, letting sunlight flood the hallway. The warmth touched the framed photos, the soft rugs, the simple furniture, her world, her truth. She took a deep breath, feeling it fill her chest completely. They said I didn't belong, she murmured, smiling now, but I was exactly where I was meant to be. The red dress shimmered one last time in the light before she stepped outside. And as the narrator's voice fades in, sometimes the cruelest nights teach the gentlest lessons. Emily's story isn't about revenge, it's about grace, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. If you believe kindness and dignity are the true signs of strength, leave A in the comments like this story and subscribe for more tales that touch the heart. And when you're ready, click the video on your screen to watch another story that will move you just as deeply.